We're going to start with the lobes of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, constitutes a gray area on the surface of it, which is called the cortex, and then deep to that is the white matter. So it's just the opposite of the spinal cord. We're also going to look at the cerebellum, and we'll spend time on the brainstem as well. So we're going to get started with the first lobe, which is the frontal lobe. And this is the largest of the lobes. So I'm just going to draw a line right here, illustrate where the frontal lobe is located. So this would fill out that cranial cavity, that anterior cavity, and that frontal lobe is going to sit right in there. Now I've also drawn this line right here, and I want to point this out as this is the central sulcus. This is a groove down the lateral side of the brain that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So this is the largest lobe of the cerebrum, and it is involved in voluntary muscle control. So your skeletal muscles, the vast majority of them are under your voluntary control, and this happens at a specific location in this frontal lobe called the precentral gyrus. And that's going to be this area right here. So all along this area, there are neurons, cell bodies, that are involved in your motor movements. This is also a large area of the brain that is involved in motivation, your mood, and emotion. It's involved in your judgment, so keeping your emotions under control, your judgment in what it is you should be doing or not doing, and your social ability. The right side of the brain develops first in utero. And during childhood, especially during those first 2 years of life, the right side of your brain is very concerned with making connections, so attachments. This part of the brain has circuits for memory, particularly declarative memories. So your memories of people, places, and things, and also your working memory. So memory of how it is that you do something, if you are in the process of doing something. Let's say you are looking for your keys. You left them somewhere in the house and you're having to go back to find them. So you're having to kind of retrace your steps and remember things. That's a working memory. Inputting a phone number, inputting information onto a document, onto a form. Those are aspects of working memory. We're going to look at the next lobe, the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe, temporal, time. More so, this is about language. So the temporal lobe is very much involved in language processing. But notice that it's on the side of the head, so it's closest to the ear, so it's also involved in hearing. So language processing, hearing, so processing sound, even if it's not a language-based sound. It has memory circuits for faces. So there's a very specific place in the temporal lobe. It's towards this anterior and medial portion of the temporal lobe, and it's very involved in face recognition. So other memory circuits are, again, for declarative information, so places and objects. It is also involved in procedural memories. So this is skill-oriented. And since it is skill-oriented, it works closely with the cerebellum. And it is also involved in emotion processing, especially the medial part of the temporal lobe, because it is close to the structures that are involved in the limbic system and the next area that I'm going to talk about. So this next area is called the insula, and it's not something that we can see on this lateral view. We would literally have to take off the temporal lobe and peer inside in order to see the insula. But it is an area of cortex that is deep to the temporal lobe. Cortex meaning it's that gray matter. Meaning that that's where the cell bodies are located. And many of those are going to have integrative function, meaning they're taking in information, they're processing it, they're making decisions about it, they're storing some of that information. And so what does this lobe do? It's an integrating center for pain and taste, so integrating those two things together. Pain and emotion. And look, down here, the temporal lobe, that was involved in emotion processing. But the insula is also big involved in empathy. So that makes sense. Pain, applying that, integrating that with emotion. So if we feel pain and we know, we recognize what emotions are going on with that, we put that together, then if someone else is experiencing that, we can understand it deeply. That's empathy, understanding deeply what another person is going through. Next part of the brain is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is right behind the frontal lobe, so that central sulcus, that groove, is really our landmark for dividing the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And just like we saw pre-central gyrus for the frontal lobe, we have a post-central gyrus for the parietal lobe. And this is involved in somesthetic or somatosensory integration. So basically it is integrating sensory information from all over the body. So touch, pressure, tickle, vibration, hot, cold, all of that somatosensory information is coming into this part of the brain. It will then be filtered out into the rest of this area for associating it or integrating it with other modalities like visual information and auditory information and taste and proprioception. So I mentioned this word a couple times in some previous lectures. Proprioception. These are receptors all over the body, specifically associated with muscle and the connective tissue of your joints. These receptors send information back to the brain in multiple locations to let the brain know where your body is in space and time. Where is that limb? Where is that finger? Where is that foot? All of those body parts. Your brain needs to know where those things are so that it can coordinate movements for the next thing that you're going to do. So a lot of that information is integrated here with other sensory modalities in the parietal lobe. Now, one of those modalities that I mentioned has a very specific place where it's processed, and that's visual. So we're at the occipital lobe, and this is a very specific lobe dedicated to vision and depth perception. And I'm just abbreviating that. That's perception. Okay, so those are our 5 lobes, and we can see them all here on the lateral side of the brain with the exception of the insula because that is deep to the temporal lobe, but all of them are here. So let me go ahead and write this one out for you too. So the last thing that we can see here in our lateral view that I'm going to talk about briefly is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is known as the hindbrain. It's also called the baby brain. So let's put that in quotations. However, this baby brain structure has more than 50% of all brain neurons. That's a lot. It is highly involved in proprioception. Okay, abbreviating. Highly involved in that, in proprioception and motor coordination. And it has a huge list of things that it's involved in, but I'm just going to mention a couple. Puzzles. It's involved in solving puzzles or problem solving. and timekeeping. So your ability to kind of think about how much time has passed, like how long has it taken for us to get through these 5 lobes plus the cerebellum. I'm guessing probably about 20 minutes. Probably about 20 minutes. The diencephalon is a structure within the brain composed of 3 elements. So we have the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the epithalamus. Okay? So, thalamus should be center, right in the center. So let's get that structure, illustrate that out. There is the thalamus. This structure is bilateral, so meaning that if we divide the brain in half, we're going to see a part of it on both sides. Same thing for the hypothalamus. Hypo meaning below. So there is our hypothalamus. And epi means above. So we're going to find that structure up here, coming down to a little circle portion right there. That's the epithalamus. All right, so let's look at each of these structures now. I'm going to start with the thalamus. This is the gateway to the cortex, meaning that all information that comes from the body is going to pass through this structure before it goes on to the rest of the cerebrum. So, thalamus. This is the gateway to the cortex. Remember, cortex is the gray matter of the cerebrum. So what does that mean? It means all sensory info passes through this area. Of course, there's exceptions to everything. So, except some olfactory signals. Okay, remember olfactory is for smell. Okay, which bypass it. Okay, the thalamus also acts as a relay station. So, there are feedback loops that take place in this area. Some of these feedback loops are for motor signals that occur between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So it's almost like this is a checkpoint, okay? Information is relayed between the cerebrum and the cerebellum into here. It's like, okay, let me check this. Does this make sense? Does this go together? All right, it can pass. So it does that between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and it also does it between the cerebrum and another structure called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is actually multiple components of the brain that are deep structures, largely involved in motor movements. Okay, the second part of this, as it's a relay station, is involved in memory and emotion. And it works closely with a structure that I've already mentioned, which is the limbic system. So that is several portions of brain that have networks, neural pools, and they work in circuits, and it just works through these circuits, keeps on going round and round, communicating that, making those synapses stronger. So let me write here that these are basically feedback loops. They're neural circuits. All right, now let's look at the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a primitive structure of the brain and a major control center for endocrine function. Okay, remember the endocrine system involves hormones and many organs throughout the body release hormones into the blood, and the hypothalamus, so what we're saying here, is a major control center for endocrine function, which means that it is going to send out chemicals and signals in order to help maintain the homeostasis of those. So it's also involved as a major control center, not only for the endocrine function, but for the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so that is not under your conscious control. And so this is for homeostatic control. Okay, now, so what does it do? Secretes hormones. I think that's given. Secretion of hormones, that's in the title. Okay. Autonomic system function. So it's going to regulate blood pressure. And if you need to write these out, you can go back and slow this down. Heart rate, GI regulation, so that's your gastrointestinal tract. Pupillary diameter, so how big do your pupils get? Thermoregulation, okay, it has a thermostat in there that regulates your body temperature. Okay, it's involved in your hunger and thirst. So the metabolism, your balance of water, all falls under that. It is involved in sleep and wake cycles, your circadian rhythms. Memory, as a relay station. For another structure that's deep in there, which is the hippocampus, and the thalamus. So a relay station for those two. Emotion. This is where it starts, that emotional behavior. This is where it starts. Your sex drive, copulation, and orgasm. So it is involved in all of these primitive functions of the body. What does that mean? It means that a person can survive without these lobes. If they had just that deep-seated portion of the brain, because that is going to take care of all of these things. However, this part of the brain allows for motor movement so that you can go after that food, so that you can go after that mate. Because those are part of your primitive desires, primitive needs, but you've got to have some of this in order to get to those. So the sex drive, copulation, and orgasm isn't going to stop you from leading a good life. However, all of this, your cerebrum, this is the seat of your consciousness, your awareness of the whole world around you, everything that you're about and what you do. So yes, you would be lacking considerably. We would have to question the quality of life for that person if they did not have a cerebrum. All right, let's look at our last structure here, which is the epithalamus. Little tiny structure, and part of that is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is involved in your sleep and arousal. Okay, so very much connected with the hypothalamus. And it also has another part called the habenula, which is a relay between the midbrain of the brainstem and the limbic system. So this is involved in emotion. It's a relay between those. Okay, I want to go through another section of the brain, which is the brainstem. So let me switch out pages again, and let's look at the brainstem. So on this picture, this is a mid-sagittal view. We're looking right into the middle of the brain. We saw all of the cerebrum out here. We saw these very deep structures of the diencephalon right here. And then right below that is going to be the brainstem. This is our brainstem. So this is the anterior side. This is the posterior side. That way you can be oriented. This is the top, so superior, very close to that hypothalamus. Okay, and then this would be down at the spinal cord. Okay, so now we are oriented. All right, we've got 3 parts to the brainstem that we are going to look at. The first part is up here at the top, and it is all of this and this. So all of this is what is called the midbrain. Okay. All parts of this are connected with the hindbrain, which is the cerebellum. They're all connected through here. Okay, all parts of the forebrain, which is your cerebrum, are connected through here, through the midbrain. So we have a couple of landmarks. So let's look at our landmarks, because this helps us. So landmark number 1 is we have the cerebral aqueduct that flows through here. Okay, so that might ring a bell, because when we were talking about the ventricles, I said, oh, here we have fluid that comes down and goes into the 4th ventricle. Okay. Let's see, I did a pencil. So this is the cerebral aqueduct right here, and then this would be the 4th ventricle. Okay. And then from here, fluid is going to circulate all over around the outside portion of the brain, circulating within that area called the subarachnoid space. Okay, so that is one of your major landmarks. The other landmark is the colliculi. So back here on this posterior side, it looks like 2 bumps. Okay, small bumps, colliculi. The colliculi, when we look at the whole structure together, there are 4 bumps. So it is literally called a corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so let's break this down. Corpora means bodies, that's plural. Quad, 4, that means that we're going to have 4 of these bodies. Here we're just seeing 2 of them because we're looking at just half of it. Gemini, think about the zodiac sign. They're placed in twins. So the 2 that are up on the top are the superior colliculi, and they have the same function. They're involved in visual tracking, and the 2 bumps at the bottom, they have the same function. They're involved in auditory tracking. Okay, so let me write this down. The superior colliculi, okay, so we need to use that word up here, superior colliculi. I'm leaving it off because of shortness. Oh, I guess I could write it. Let me write it. Colliculi. Enough space. Visual tracking. Inferior colliculi. Auditory. Tracking. Okay, let me talk about what this means. Visual tracking. You're watching a baseball game. The batter hits the ball. It's sailing through the sky. Your eyes are tracking that ball as it moves across the sky. Your head then moves in the direction to which it is going so that you can continue to watch it. Your eyes continue to track it. So the muscles in your eyes are moving as well. That's visual tracking. Visual tracking can happen without actually processing light in the occipital lobe. I know, it's fascinating. It is. There have been studies that have been done on persons that have deficits in the occipital lobe for visual processing, and yet they can be put in front of a computer screen and something can be moving across that screen, and they just have to press a button when they sense that something is moving across the screen. Isn't that wild? Yes. So you can track something even without actually visually processing it. Okay? Cool. Auditory tracking. Auditory tracking. Imagine, well, it's hunting season, so you don't have to imagine too much. A shot is fired from a gun. Your head immediately turns to the direction in which you heard it first. Okay? That is audio tracking. Or somebody calls your name and you turn towards them. Auditory tracking. Okay? There are places that are connected with this that are in the spinal tract, that are in the spinal cord. And some of these are called tectospinal tract. Okay, so this is a spinal tract that is reflexive. It responds in reflex to visual or auditory. So reflexive head turning. Okay, and it gets the name tectospinal tract because of the place in the midbrain called the tectum. Oops, I forgot the letter C. Shoot. Tectum. All right, so I just botched the spelling of that. It's T-E-C-T-U-M. Tectum. There's another place in the brainstem, in the midbrain. It has a very specific name. It is called the substantia nigra. Okay, this word means black. Why? Because there's melanin that is produced in this very particular place in the midbrain. Okay, this is a very important part of the midbrain. So we see disordered movements when there is a problem in this area. Okay, it's Parkinson's disease. When someone has Parkinson's disease, this part of the midbrain is not functioning correctly. There is a neurotransmitter that is produced and used in this very particular part of the brain called dopamine. Dopamine in this portion of the brain is inhibitory. It inhibits signals to skeletal muscles to prevent competing movements. Okay, so think about this for a second. When we were looking at elbow flexion, the biceps brachii and the brachialis, they were contracting, they were shortening, they were reducing the angle of the elbow. Well, while they are contracting, the triceps need to be quiet. They need to be relaxed and allow for the biceps to do their movement in order to reduce the angle of that joint. And so dopamine helps inhibit those signals. So it's inhibiting the triceps from working so that it will relax and allow the biceps and the brachialis to do their job of contracting. In someone that has Parkinson's disease, there is not enough dopamine. And so then you've got both the antagonist and the agonist muscles are trying to work at the same time. That doesn't work. And so they're not able to move properly. And you see that tremor, the shaking that happens in those patients. So one of the medications that they're given is L-DOPA. So that is left chiral position of the molecule, the dopamine molecule, and it's a pretty high dose. This portion of the brain requires a high dose of dopamine, but it also acts on other parts of the brain as well, in that reward center and various other places of the brain. So then you can see all types of problems that can come when taking this type of medication. Parkinson's disease is a dyskinesia, meaning it's a movement disorder. A movement disorder. Okay? Now, there are two cranial nerves that I want to mention here as well at the midbrain. Now, we did not study this on the models. I said I didn't want you memorizing those on the models. I'm just going to talk about them here. Okay? The cranial nerves. There's two. Cranial nerve, oculomotor. Okay, this is number 3. Cranial nerve. Oculo, eye, motor, movement. This particular cranial nerve is for eyeball movement. So this innervates 3-4 muscles of the eye, extrinsic muscles of the eye, to move it, to move the eyeball. Okay, the other cranial nerve is the trochlear. and this is cranial nerve number 4. Okay, it's not intuitive what this one is for, but this one also moves one of the eye muscles, and it's called the trochlear because of the way that the connective tissue makes a little loop and the muscle goes through it. Okay, so it's kind of like a pulley system. So these two cranial nerves are associated with the midbrain. All right, let's look at the pons. The pons is this bulge right here. So you'll notice this when we are doing the sheep dissection, the pons. You'll notice that bulge. This has a significant connection to the cerebellum. It has many sensory tracts for proprioception, that pass through here, enter in here for integration. Many sensory tracts for proprioception enter the pons for integration. And then it is relayed to the cerebellum. Okay, so significant connection to the cerebellum. This is why. Because so many sensory tracts for proprioception have to come in here. They integrate their information in the pons and then go on to the cerebellum. There are several cranial nerves that are associated with the pons. So let me go through these. The trigeminal. So this is cranial nerve number 5. The facial, cranial nerve number 7. The abducens, cranial number 6. This innervates one of your eye muscles. So you've got ocular, motor, trochlear, and abducens all function in moving the muscles that are around the eyeball so that your eyeball can roll around in your head. Okay, and our 4th cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear. Vestibulocochlear. So this is cranial nerve number 8. And this is involved in balance, equilibrium, and hearing. So the cochlea. Okay, I want to talk now about our last part of the brainstem, which is the medulla oblongata. So down here, all of this, till we get to the spinal cord. So the medulla oblongata all spinal tracts pass through here. Okay, in other words, all sensory coming up, all motor going down, everything passes through here. There's just a couple of things that I want to focus on for the medulla oblongata, and then we are wrapping it up. So there are a couple of very specific centers in the medulla oblongata. One of these is called the vasomotor center. So this involves the diameter of blood vessels. So this is under the autonomic function of raising and lowering that, widening or constricting the diameter of those blood vessels, so vasovascular. The other one is the cardiac center. Okay, again, another center that is involved with the autonomic nervous system. Cardiac center, so this is a place where heart rate, blood pressure, and force of contraction take place. Force of contraction. Respiratory centers. There are also respiratory centers in the pons, one specifically in the pons, but there's two in the medulla oblongata. Okay, respiratory center, so rate and depth of breathing. Depth. And then finally there's osmoregulators. So these are specialized receptors that detect changes in the cerebral spinal fluid. So they're looking at fluid concentration of carbon dioxide, which is indirectly involved in changing of pH, and it's also looking at levels of sodium. Okay, so carbon dioxide indirectly involved in pH and sodium. Okay, this is in no way an exhaustive list of all the functions that these things do. In fact, this is just a snapshot of what these different structures are involved in. There is so much more, but we cannot go through everything. We're going through those things that I feel are going to come up at another time. And so with that, we will close out for today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great day of learning.